There is a word you use almost every day that your ancestors did not have. Not because they hadn't invented the language for it yet, because they never needed it. Hunger. They had a word for that. Fear. They had a word for that. Grief. They had a word for that. Anthropologists who have spent years living with the Hadza of Tanzania, the Pirahan of the Amazon, the San of the Kalahari, report the same strange gap.
Ask someone in these cultures to describe the feeling of having nothing to do and nowhere to be, and time stretching out empty in front of them. Most of them can't, not because they're too polite to complain, because the feeling barely exists for them. So where did boredom come from? And why can't you escape it? Let's start with the obvious assumption. Maybe hunter-gatherers were just too busy to ever feel bored. That's not quite true. Remember, the Hadza work about 2.5 hours a day. The Coon Bushmen, according to anthropologist Richard Lee, clocked around 15 hours of labor a week. Here's what fills that time instead. Constant, low-level environmental engagement. A Hadza man resting in the shade is still listening. For birds that signal a predator nearby. For the specific call that means honey has been found. For the footsteps of someone approaching camp. His senses are never fully off duty. That leaves enormous stretches of unstructured time. Hours of sitting. Hours of walking. Hours of doing, by modern standards, nothing at all. If boredom were simply the absence of tasks, these should be the most bored people on earth. They are not. A woman walking back from gathering is reading the ground, tracking which plants are ripening, noticing which trees fruited early this year, filing it away for next season. None of this looks like activity. It doesn't look like work, but it is never truly idle. The brain stays engaged with something that matters, something with a stake attached to it. Even conversation works this way. Remember, anthropologist Polly Wiesner found that the Bushmen spend hours every evening talking. Who hunted well? Who has been quiet lately? Who might be sick? That isn't idle chatter to fill silence. It's social tracking. The same instinct that once decided who you could trust, who you could rely on, who might get you killed. Even rest in this world is a form of attention. Now compare that to a person sitting in a waiting room. Phone dead, nothing to track, nothing that depends on their attention. That is a kind of empty modern humans were never designed to encounter. And it turns out, we gave it a name surprisingly recently. The word boredom does not appear in English until the 1850s. It shows up for the first time in print in Charles Dickens' novel Bleak House, published in 1852. A character complains of being, in her words, bored. Readers at the time found the word almost foreign. It needed explaining in footnotes. Before this, there was no single word in English for this specific feeling. People had words for melancholy, words for idleness, words for restlessness. But not this particular flavor of empty, trapped, low-grade suffering that comes from being stuck somewhere with nothing meaningful to do. That word had to be invented because the experience it described had to be invented first, and the timing is not a coincidence. The 1850s sit right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. For the first time in human history, large numbers of people were spending entire days performing the same narrow motion, pulling the same lever, tightening the same bolt, watching the same machine. No tracking, no reading the landscape, no social monitoring, no stake in the outcome beyond a wage. Factory work removed almost everything the human brain evolved to pay attention to and replaced it with repetition that required just enough attention to prevent you from leaving, but not enough
to feel like it mattered. This, psychologists now argue, is the actual recipe for boredom. Not lack of stimulation, lack of meaningful stimulation. In 2014, a team of researchers led by psychologist Timothy Wilson ran an experiment that became infamous.
Historians have noted something else from this period. Reports of nervous exhaustion, melancholia, and a vague, unnamed restlessness spike sharply among factory workers in the decades after industrialization spreads. Doctors at the time didn't have a clean diagnosis for it. They just knew something about prolonged, meaningless repetition was making people sick in a way physical labor never had.
They asked participants to simply sit alone in a room for 15 minutes. No phone, no book, nothing to do but think. Many described the experience as deeply unpleasant. Then, Wilson's team gave participants another option. They could press a button and receive a mild electric shock instead. A significant number of people who had previously said they would pay money to avoid being shocked chose to shock themselves rather than sit with their own thoughts. Being alone with an empty mind was worse than physical pain. This tracks with something researchers have observed in a much darker setting. Studies on prolonged solitary confinement describe inmates developing severe anxiety, hallucinations, and breakdowns, not primarily from isolation itself, but from the total absence of anything to track, predict, or respond to. The human mind, left with nothing external to engage, does not settle into calm. It starts to come apart. This is the part that should stop you. The discomfort wasn't coming from having nothing around them. It was coming from having nothing to do that connected to anything beyond the room itself. No goal, no tracking, no consequence, just time with the meaning drained out of it. That is the exact texture of boredom. And it is almost the opposite of what a hunter-gatherer experiences sitting quietly in camp. Their stillness is connected to something, a coming storm, a returning hunter, a child learning to use a digging stick nearby. Ours, increasingly, is connected to nothing at all. And here is the part that should really worry you. We built the most stimulating environment in the history of our species, and boredom did not go away. It got worse. Researchers studying attention and mood report rising rates of chronic boredom, specifically among people with constant access to entertainment. Endless video, endless scrolling, algorithms built to fill every open second. And still, people describe feeling bored more often than ever before. Surveys tracking self-reported boredom across decades show the feeling climbing steadily, even as the number of available distractions climbs alongside it. More content, more boredom, not less. This stops being confusing once you understand what boredom actually is. It isn't a lack of input, it's a lack of agency. Watching a screen feed you content requires almost nothing from you. No tracking, no consequence, no stake. It is, neurologically, closer to the factory floor than to a day spent foraging. You are being acted upon. You are not acting. A Hadza child playing with a digging stick beside her mother is engaged in something with real consequence. She is learning a skill she will use for the rest of her life. A modern child swiping through short videos is engaged in something with no consequence at all. Both look occupied. Only one of them is actually filling the hole boredom describes. So the feeling you get reaching for your phone, in line at the store, in the quiet seconds before a meeting, in bed at night when you can't sleep, is not your brain asking for stimulation. It's your brain asking for a reason, something to track, something to build, something with a stake attached to it. For 300,000 years, that reason was built into almost every waking hour. Tracking animals, reading weather.
Some researchers now believe this is why hobbies involving real skill and real stakes, gardening, building, learning an instrument, raising an animal, relieve boredom in a way that passive scrolling never quite manages. They put something back that the factory floor took out. A consequence. A reason to pay attention. The word didn't exist for most of human history because the feeling didn't need to exist. Maintaining relationships that determined whether you survived the season. We removed almost all of it. And then we tried to fill the gap with content instead of meaning. It hasn't worked. We built a world efficient enough to remove nearly all of our ancestors' daily struggle. And in the empty space that struggle used to occupy, we found something we had never had to name before. We finally had to invent a word for it. Because for the first time, we had to live inside it.